Hello, I'm Ed Fuquay, Young Adult Librarian Extraordinaire here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
Solitaire Frisbee from the children's room.
We're having another conversations and we're still on the topic of Polynesian mythology.
Awesome.
So what do you think of it so far?
Intrigued. Certainly with your brother.
Yep, well, that's my brother. We've gotten up to the stories of Maui,
Okay.
who is made very famous by the Disney movie Moana,
Mm-hmm.
which wasn't a bad interpretation of his character really in a lot of ways. They toned down a lot of things, they changed a few things around. One problem dealing with Maui is that he's revered in almost every Polynesian island, and there are thousands of them. So to a certain extent, there's a different version of Maui for every island. So you can find stories where Maui is incredibly clever, and stories where he's incredibly stupid, and stories where he, teaches mankind everything they need to know to survive, and stories where he fights monsters, like a totally different personality. In a sense, they're all Maui. The two biggest areas that we have for folklore is New Zealand with the Maori stories, and Hawaii, of course.
Well, you mentioned he was toned down.
Yeah. I'm combining the Hawaiian and the Maori stories together with trying to come up with a sort of syncretic version of his life,
Okay.
which is, full of contradictions. And every character has 3 or 4 names, as we often find in mythology. These are all oral legends stretched across thousands of years of history before anyone bothered to write them down. He was never worshipped as a god. There were never any temples to him, never any sacrifices. He was just Maui, Generally a well-meaning friend to mankind, but not always. He was a trickster god. He was a cultural hero who taught mankind various crafts and skills and things like that. He's very much the Polynesian version of like Thor and Hercules. There's a lot of strong parallels. Both Thor and Hercules, when you get to them, will do things that are sometimes like really dumb and violent. So we'll say in this version of the story, he was born to Turanga. He had a magical birth. When Turanga was walking along the beach, she found a red loincloth that had been washed up by the sea. And so she wrapped it around herself, and then she became with child. See, magic birth.
I see.
Now, of all the magic births that we'll get to in mythology, that is one of the most unique and interesting. It might well symbolize something, but I don't know what it is. So anyway, so she gives birth. However, he's born prematurely. And perhaps not sensing he's really a god, she believes he's not going to survive. So she wraps him up in her own hair and sets him on a jellyfish that happens to be floating by and sends him off to the sea, to his fate. It's very sad, and they make a big thing about that in the movie Moana.
Solely because he might not have been a god?
No, because she believes that he was born too early and wouldn't survive.
Oh.
That's one reason for it. There's several others in different versions of the story. That's the one that cuts her the most slack.
Okay.
So he clearly didn't recognize that he was of divine origin for whatever reason. She sends him off, and fortunately ocean spirits find him, and so they direct the jellyfish toward the island where his grandfather lives, who will raise him. The grandfather tries to perform a blessing over him that will guarantee him the full powers of a god, but he gets interrupted and doesn't finish it. So Maui never winds up getting full godhood, which is why he's technically mortal.
Okay.
Despite everything that he does, he's still a mortal person.
So this grandfather,
Yep.
would this be on the side of the red loincloth?
His godly side, yes, the loincloth side of his heritage.
Okay.
All right, so eventually he grows up. He decides to find his mother, and he gets a canoe and paddles to the island where his mother lives. And the mother has had like several children since then. They're his siblings. There are, I think there's 4 brothers and 1 sister, or 5 brothers and 1 sister. It varies. When he gets there, though, the mother doesn't recognize him and says she has no idea who he is. So he has to prove himself by a feat of great strength. So what he does is he winds up picking up some spears, and he hurls the spears through the doorposts to the hut where they all live, which for whatever reason indicates that he really belongs there.
All right.
After he does his feat of tremendous strength, she recognizes him. Wait, you're the kid that I put in the ocean. You must be little Maui. So he comes back and he's welcomed into the family. So he starts off a series of adventures. And there's a ton of them. There are hundreds of Maui stories. Some of them I'll give you like thumbnail descriptions of. In this time period, the underworld was where the dead lived, and it wasn't always a bad place. The Polynesians didn't have any concept of being punished in the afterlife until the missionaries got there. So the underworld was just the place you went when you were dead. And it wasn't a particularly nice place. You'd rather be in the sunshine and the fresh air and everything, but still. Maui would routinely go into the underworld and meet up with his ancestors who had passed away, who would give him gifts and presents and things like that that would help him on his journey. Maui Rangamanua was one of his great-grandparents who gave him his jaw to carve into his giant fish hook that became his signature weapon. There's a version where Maui actually like starves the old man to death and then like steals the jaw when he's unconscious. But we'll forget about that one and go with the one where he's actually given the giant jawbone to carve up into the fish hook himself. And later, another one of his ancestors will give him a magic potion that makes him super strong, because humanity was complaining that the sky was so low, no one could get around and do anything. So they wanted to raise the sky up. So this is the New Zealand version of it. The Hawaiian version, somebody else raises the sky. So he drank the potion to give him extra super strength, and he lifts the sky up there and thinks, okay, this isn't high enough. So he climbs to the top of the tallest mountain he could find, positioning the sky above his head, and then hurls it as high as he can go, so the sky is always way up there.
Okay.
And then people are free to stand up straight and walk and go as they please. Although the leaves of the palm tree are still flat, you may notice. From back in the days, they were pressed flat by the sky.
I see.
Yep, explains it. Makes sense now. And once the sky is open, wind starts blowing for the first time. And so Maui invents kites, which is cool. However, Maui also realizes all the great things you can do with wind. So he invents like sails for canoes and teaches humanity how to sail from one island to another using the wind.
Yeah.
So that's his cultural hero bit right there.
Okay.
He had a wife named Hina, we're going to say, although I found at least 4 different versions of his wife. And one, he's married to several women at the same time. We'll just say he's married to Hina. She's very beautiful. There's a version of her origin story in which she's married to Hopu Kona, who is a giant eel, or an eel man. But that is an unhappy marriage, and so she slips out away from the sea and comes to land, taking on lovers. And she wants to find some lover who could possibly free her from this unhappy marriage.
All right, I missed something. What is she to have been existing in the sea?
I don't know. She's a human, but when she's taken under the sea by Hopu Kona, he somehow protects her from drowning.
Okay.
Or she could be a goddess herself in some version of the story.
Okay.
So eventually, of course, she stumbled across Maui, who is more than willing to fulfill her needs. So he has a huge fight against the giant eel. There's, again, a couple of different versions of it. So eventually he defeats Hopu Kona, and he chops into pieces with his fish hook, and the chunks of them that fly off all become different kinds of eels that populate the oceans of the world.
Yeah.
So he accidentally creates all these other eels while chopping up the giant one that he's fighting. And then the end, he decapitates him and takes the head and buries it in the ground. And then what should happen? But from that very spot where he buried the head, a palm tree should grow. And on the palm tree is coconuts. Everybody loves coconuts.
Right.
So they provide delicious milk, and you can eat coconut.
You can.
Yes. Now, interestingly, the Polynesians believed that coconuts hanging in the tree look kind of like human skulls. If you break them open, they're white inside, kind of like a human head when you break it open. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
See, it all makes sense now.
It does.
Yeah, you see, that's Maui in action. So he marries Hina, and they're very happy together. His most famous trick, and the ones that there's a lot of pictures of on the internet, his brothers are making fun of him because for all his amazing feats, he was a terrible fisherman. They were always able to get more fish and bigger fish than Maui. Here he has this giant fish hook and everything. So he's determined to do a better job than them. So they're all out in their canoe fishing. and he hurls his fish hook down as far as it can go, and he catches something. And he tells his brothers, okay guys, start paddling right now, I got something really big. And so they start paddling really hard, and he keeps going, come on, faster, faster. So he's building it up, and the poor brothers are pumping away and faster, and then finally he yanks it up and goes, it wasn't a fish at all, it's the island of New Zealand. He pulled it right off the floor of the ocean up into the sky.
Thank goodness he did.
Yeah, I know. And it's a cunning trick to pull, and his brothers, oddly enough, fell for this several times. So, although Hawaii has a story how Pele ran across the Pacific creating islands, this is a story of how Maui actually did it from the New Zealand version.
Okay.
Yeah.
Suppose it's not entirely wrong, and a
Yeah.
lot of what comes up from...
Yeah. There's a version in which he actually does bring up a giant fish, and he wants to get a priest to do a blessing over it before they carve it up and eat it. But his brothers can't resist chopping it to pieces, and the chunks of the fish they throw become all the Polynesian islands that are scattered across the sea. But in most of the versions, because it's funnier, it actually has him pulling up the entire complete island already intact.
Gosh.
Okay, so not everything he does works out the way he plans. His sister was married, and he and his brother-in-law were out fishing one day, and he had a huge quarrel. What they fought over differs at every version, but they had a fight. Maui lost his temper and killed the guy. So he went, oh geez, now I'm in trouble. Okay, I can fix this. So he took what was left of the body. He had broken so many bones, he couldn't actually get it back together again. So he was forced to reshape it. And he wasn't terribly good at that. So he wound up coming up with something that had 4 legs, a tail, and kind of a snout on the head. And it was covered in fur. So he paddles back to shore, and his sister comes out and says, Maui, where's my husband? He says, try calling his name. And so she calls his name, and something comes bounding out of the boat, which is the world's first dog. And it comes running up to her. And she says, Maui, what have you done? And he's like, I changed him into a dog. He's better now. See? You're welcome. Yeah.
It's a rough day.
Yeah, that was Maui. Some things worked out better than that. One thing his mother did was she made a lot of tapa cloth, which is cloth that's made from the bark of a tree, if you can believe that. They would peel the bark off a tree, soak it in water for a while, and then pound it out flat with a rock, and it actually made into a flexible cloth. They could make clothing out of, they could do wall tapestries out of it, really gorgeous stuff. They've been making tapa since time immemorial. But the problem is in those days, because the world was still young, the sun was racing across the sky so quickly, the days didn't last very long.
Mm-hmm.
So his mother said to him, Maui, with all these people you've been helping, can you help me dry all this tapa cloth? And he said, no problem, Mom. So using a very, very long rope and his giant fish hook, he was able to capture the sun and drag him down. And then he beat him up so badly that instead of racing across the sky, the sun now just sort of limps slowly across the sky. It takes him hours to get from one horizon to another.
That must have been some impressive aloe vera gel.
Yep. Pretty amazing. Yeah, that's Maui for you. However, as I said at the beginning of his legend, he was in fact mortal. And he noticed that human beings were getting old and dying, and one day he was going to die too. So, much like Gilgamesh or the Monkey King before him, he too sought the secret of immortality.
Okay.
Now, there is a goddess named Hainenua Tipo. Now, Hainenua Tipo was the goddess of death and the night. So she was a death goddess. So Maui hit on this theory. He came up with a clever plan. So he realized where babies come from. And she's the goddess of death. So he thought if he reversed the process and went inside of her and emerged from her mouth, he would be reborn and he would be immortal. So right away, that tells you that Maui didn't have a firm grasp of female anatomy.
Well, wait a minute. He came from a loincloth.
That's true. So there's no reason why he really should understand biology. So he goes out to try to accomplish this, accompanied by some of his bird companions. And some versions there, his brothers that he changes into birds. There are versions in which Haini Nuatipo is an absolute like giantess and has to actually go spelunking. There's other versions of which she's normal sized, but he shrinks himself down. He's a shapeshifter. He shrinks himself down to a worm to wriggle inside of her. And he warns the birds not to make a sound because he creeps up while she's sleeping. So right away, this is horrible, non-consensual, as well as being dubious on mythological and biological grounds. Yeah, so Maui does this. Whether it would work or not, we'll never know, because apparently he looked so hysterically funny doing this that one of the birds burst out laughing. And there is, in fact, a Hawaiian bird that makes a high-pitched noise, kind of like laughing, which is why they wrote him into the story. So, Nuatipo wakes up, and she senses what's going on. And she immediately clenches up as tight as she can. Now, it just so happens that her insides are lined with razor-sharp obsidian teeth. Yeah.
That could be.
Yeah.
That could be a good feature for some women.
It could be very, very useful. Yeah, that was the end of poor Maui. He didn't get away with this. He didn't become immortal or give immortality to humanity. That's yeah. Now there is.
Hold on. This is how he met his end?
That is how he died. That is his tragic death. There's versions of the story which he tries to go down her mouth. What we saw in the Disney movie Moana was a very, 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 very sanitized and boulderized version of that, where he tries to get to the heart of Te Fiti.
So there was a parallel.
Yeah, that's where they got the idea from. They realized they couldn't possibly use any version of the actual myth.
Wow. But behind the scenes they did.
Yeah, but they must have heard the original stories.
Wow.
There is a version where he goes through her mouth and is actually chewed up by her regular teeth. And that one he's actually trying to go down her throat to reach her actual heart in her chest.
Still as a worm?
Probably, yeah. Yeah.
That's.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's pretty messed up.
Yep.
There's really no place to go from there, unfortunately.
There really isn't.
Yeah. But apart from that little thing, if you watch Moana, in his You're Welcome song, everything that he mentions in that song is actually a real myth, most of which I just name dropped here. All the things he talks about in that extremely catchy song
All right.
are things that he actually did in some Hawaiian or New Zealand myth.
Good to know.
Yeah. That's a legend of Maui.
I think that we should begin rating all of the different characters. And as of right now, I don't know if that puts him at the top or bottom of the list.
Well, we haven't even gotten to Greek and Norse gods yet. We still got the big, most famous gods coming.
I'm personally distraught as a female.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I should have put a trigger warning in, shouldn't I? I'm terrible with that. I should have put a trigger warning in.
It's okay.
I mean, at least he dies doing this, so it's not like he actually gets away with anything.
A worm.
Yeah, yeah.
And the bird? What kind? Do we know what kind of bird?
I think it's the name of the bird. It is an actual bird they based that inspired the myth.
Very cool.
So we'll continue on next week, if you're ready.
But that is in fact the end.
That's the end of Maui's story, yeah, yeah. And the other ones I skipped over, like how he discovered fire and so forth, but I want to hit all the high spots.
He came from the loincloth.
Yeah.
He had a series of adventures.
Mm-hmm.
Did I miss it somehow? Was there any kind of theme that continued throughout? Was he on any kind of a specific quest? Was he trying to?
Not really, no.
He was just existing.
This is probably, he just hung around and did stuff. Unlike a work of fiction, mythology doesn't really have to have an overwhelming theme to it. And plus, these are all stories from scattered islands across the Pacific.
Okay.
Many of which had different views of who he was and what he was like.
Interesting. All right. We'll have to check out the song.
Yep. Yeah, it's a great movie and a great song. So I was thinking moving on next week and doing Hindu gods. But I can't guarantee it'll be all that much better. I think they will, though.
We'll see.
All right. All right, we'll see you all next week. Until then, I have been Ed.
And Solitaire.
We'll see you next time.